Hello. Recently, I finished reading a great big classic that I ended up feeling very mixed about. In some ways, I found it very entertaining and engaging and fascinating to consider because it is packed full of so many ideas and complex characters. But then some parts of it were very frustrating and tedious and antiquated, but at the same time, I feel like all the parts of this great big novel add up to say something much bigger and still have a relevance. So I want to talk about all of my thoughts and feelings about this book, which is Thomas Mann's The Magic Mountain, this great big 700 plus page 20th century classic. And I'd love to hear from you if you have read this book and what you think about it, or if you're interested in reading it now. I mean, why I read it now was for a few different reasons. I mean, firstly, with my online book club, I'm currently reading Olga Tokarczuk's new novel, The Empusium, which is heavily inspired by Thomas Mann's novel. So I wanted to read this first. Secondly, it was the 100th anniversary of the initial publication of this novel last year. And then thirdly, I almost died visiting the physical location and initial inspiration for this novel of when I was on holiday in Davos in Switzerland. There, high up in the mountains there used to exist a sanatorium, which I believe now is a hotel. And Thomas Mann's wife went there when she was looking to be cured from a respiratory illness, and Thomas Mann spent some time there, and he was inspired to write this novel. Now, when I was traveling through Switzerland, we stopped in Davos and thought while we were there, why not go to see this location that inspired this great classic, even though I'd never actually read it at that point. And so I found the location of this former sanatorium high up in the mountains on Google Maps, had a route there, followed that route, which turned out to be a footpath that we were driving on around bends high up in this mountain and over a very delicate bridge. I honestly thought we might die going on this path, which got increasingly narrow and more treacherous. We finally got out the other side and survived, but ever since then, I've always felt like, oh, I want to fictionally travel to this location, but not actually physically go there because it was far too treacherous, and we never actually made it there, but we did make it out alive. So now I've finally read the book, and this location, which is a very strange place, like high up in the mountains, and provides this kind of eerie setting that's sort of out of time, but also is entrenched in a certain period of history, because this novel is set in the years leading up to World War I. Now, before I get into talking much more about this book, I just want to quickly mention a bit about the translations. If you're thinking of reading this book, there's two main English translations, and I actually read this book both sort of switching between the two different translations. So this physical copy of this vintage edition of the novel that I read, this was translated by Helen Tracy Lowe Porter in 1927, just a few years after it was first published. But then there is also a John Wood's translation of the novel in English that was done in 1996. And so when I was at home, I was reading the physical copy of this earlier translation, and then when I was out and about, I was listening to an audiobook of the more recent translation of this novel. And I did find the more recent translation was much smoother and felt a bit more like contemporary in the style of its prose. This earlier translation in the physical form does feel slightly clunkier, and yeah, just the sentence structure just didn't quite work as well for me. And looking online, it seems a lot of readers have that same consensus that the more modern translation is kind of the more preferable redeemable one. Although, yeah, so it was interesting to experience the book both ways. But if I was going to reread it, I would just read the John E. Wood's translation of it. Very briefly, the plot of this novel concerns a young man named Hans Kostorp, who has just been studying engineering. He's about to embark on his adult life and his career, but he's diverted to go visit his cousin Joachim, who is staying at this sanatorium high up in the Swiss Alps, because he's suffering from tuberculosis, and so he's been staying there for a while. And Hans wants to go see his cousin to support him, but also to have a bit of a holiday. And he is only meant to stay there for a few mere weeks, but then his stay ends up getting extended by many, many years, and he ends up staying there 7 years in total. During this time, Hans becomes entrenched in the routines and the insular nature of this specialized hospital, and also engages in many discussions with its European residents, many of whom are also long-time patients at this sanatorium, and who some of them do come and go, and some of them, of course, eventually die and are kind of whisked away. There's this whole kind of behind-the-scenes nature of the hospital where people who die are just kind of taken away and then not really spoken of much again. And like I said, this all takes place in the decade leading up to the First World War, and really the specter of this upcoming conflict really hangs over this entire narrative. So I found this novel both challenging and fascinating for a number of different reasons, and I'll start with the positives. So I enjoyed some of the humorous encounters between these characters. There are some absolutely beautiful descriptions in this book, both of the physical environment and the psychological state of the characters. It's very artistically structured when considering how this novel is put together and the way the narrative moves. It says something in itself about the story, and there are also a number of deep philosophical diatribes about big subjects concerning life and illness and sexuality and society and war and time. And some of these are really interesting to consider, and others go on a bit too long. And also the overall story of this book, it's a kind of stalled coming-of-age tale, because Hans Kastorp is about to launch into his adult life when he's diverted to this sanatorium, and so instead of really growing and developing and living a full adult life, he's stuck in kind of bogged down in this kind of strange existence that's far removed from reality, and he does grow and develop as a character over the course of the novel, because he develops a passion and falls in love with an elusive character named Madame Chauchat, and but also he learns more about music and about science, and he engages with the ideas of a number of men that want to mentor him and kind of teach him about their big philosophical ideas and about the world. And even though Hans is a kind of conservative and in some ways like priggish character, I did come to feel endeared towards him for a number of different reasons, because he comes from this orphaned background, that he lost a number of his closest family members like during his adolescence and childhood, but also he's an impressionable youth that falls under the sway of this kind of society in microcosm that exists in this sanatorium. After consulting with the sanatorium's doctors, he believes that he needs to become a patient at this sanatorium as well. And so he falls into the routines of obsessively taking his temperature and having these rest cures where he wraps himself in multiple blankets to expose himself to the refreshing mountain air for extended hours every single day. And also all of the residents engage in these lavish meals, which include second breakfasts, which I couldn't help thinking about the Hobbit and how hobbits, have second breakfasts every single day. So it's this very sedentary life, and everyone becomes habitualized to these routines, and they become completely normalized. And only very occasionally do we get an outside perspective, which shows just how weird life is at this sanatorium. Later in the novel, Hans's uncle comes to visit him, and his uncle just thinks that Hans is there as a kind of holiday, is just kind of taking a break there. But then Hans's uncle, the doctors there tried to draw him into the routines of the hospital as well, and he immediately becomes very wary of this and is like, no, I need to get out of here. So Hans's only social contact over these several years is with other residents at the sanatorium, and he primarily falls under the tutelage of two individuals. Firstly, there's a humanist named Settembrini, and there's a Jewish Jesuit named Nafta. And these men often have very competing ideas, very different ideas from each other, but there are long essayistic passages of these individuals speaking to Hans, and these become the most difficult things, at least for me, to read in this novel, because they are very long and they seem quite like removed from the plot and the storyline of this, that they could be kind of extracted from this book and exist outside of it as just an essay. But also these long passages often contain outmoded ideas which can be easily dismissed, such as attitudes towards women. At one point, it's questioned why women would present themselves in a desirable way if they're no longer able to bear children. And in another part, it's stated, a woman primarily regards herself as an object. And there are many other ideas in this book which feel very antiquated regarding social ideals and totalitarianism and the need for war and romance and sexuality. There's not much about these sections that I felt like I was learning from because they are such old-fashioned ideas, but they all come from particular characters. And so I think the value of them is how it gives an insight into the prevailing attitudes of some Europeans at this time, and so adds to this sense of the growing pressures and conflicts within society at that time that were leading up to World War I. Within the story itself, this also leads to a physical altercation between Settembrini and Nafta, where they clash with each other. And this is what has continued to haunt me about this story, because as they come into this irresolvable conflict with each other, Hans tries to reason with them and say, these are only abstract ideas, that they aren't personal, but then the men argue that no, these are things that we need to fight out with each other. So even though these are men with very lofty ideas, that it leads to this physical conflict with each other and great violence, and it's really shocking to read about. And I'm not going to give anything away or spoilers about it, but when I got to that passage, I was sort of like, oh my gosh, I can't believe that actually happened. But also, yeah, this conflict, which Hans tries to mediate, and isn't able to get anywhere with them. And I think this also speaks to how in society we go through cycles like this, where there can be political divisions, which on the surface just seem to be theoretical, but then that bleeds into reality and leads to violence and actual war. So outside these lengthy, problematic speeches, which were quite difficult to read, but like I said, sort of add up to something much bigger, there were many characters and scenes that I really enjoyed, and I'm just going to give a few examples of these because there are lots and lots in this book. So firstly, there's a whole section where Hans and his cousin get x-rayed for the first time. And of course, this was early on in medical science when x-rays were first being conducted. And there's very vivid descriptions of the x-rays and examining this portrait of the inside of the body and its physical workings. And so it really describes really eloquently this clash between the physical nature of the inside of a person and how that kind of relates to the emotions of the person. So to see a beating heart and then to consider the passions which are welling up within someone. And Hans carries around with him an x-ray of Madame Chauchat's chest in a way which he thinks of as very romantic, but is actually quite creepy. At one point, Madame Chauchat leaves the sanatorium for an extended period of time, but she eventually returns with a new character named Mynheer Pieperkorn, who firstly is just so much fun to say his name, but also he is one of the most lively and entertaining characters in this novel. He entices a number of characters to engage in long bouts of drinking and gambling. He's a kind of Dionysian kind of character that lures the other characters into this more debauched and behavior. But also this creates this kind of curious love triangle between Hans and Madame Chauchat and Mynheer Pieperkorn. And I like how his character also engages in these lengthy speeches, which all of the other characters do find very tedious to listen to. But at the same time, there is something about his personality which is so enticing and just draws people to him. And this feels very like true to life when I've met some people who actually their personality may be quite boring, but there is something about their character and their sociable nature which just draws so many other people to them. I also heartily enjoyed an imposing character of a nurse who sells Hans a thermometer and who considers that any activity outside of convalescence is just twiddle-twaddle. And she keeps using this phrase of twiddle-twaddle very dismissively of anyone else's opinions or ideas. There's also a mysterious Danish teenager who arrives quite late in the novel at the sanatorium, and she possesses these mystical abilities, and she conducts a number of seances with the residents and becomes a real figure of curiosity. And amidst some of her seances, the dead kind of reappear, and it's very eerie and creepy and unsettling, and so there's this surprising lengthy, quite like supernatural section later on in the book that really took me by surprise, but which I found so entrancing. My absolute favorite section of this novel is merely entitled snow. And during this, Hans goes out skiing by himself onto the Alps, which he's never done before, but he sets out on skis on this solitary journey. And the descriptions in this, the language that Thomas Mann uses in this is so incredibly beautiful. I just found it an absolute joy to read, but also it's this very contemplative journey that he goes on by himself, where it describes how one solitude leads on to another, and in some ways it feels absolutely liberating, but also it becomes very dangerous and terrifying because he gets caught up in a blizzard, and so he's just lost in this blanket of whiteness, and he kind of reclines at one point and falls into this kind of troubled sleep, or this kind of hallucinatory state where he has absolutely terrifying dreams, and he does eventually make it back to the sanatorium, but it's such a fascinating passage that is really looking at being in such a state of aloneness and trying to come to grips with the world, and how civilization still wells up inside him, even though he is all on his own out there on the mountainside covered with snow. It's a section that's both thoughtful and hypnotically surreal, and it's one of those chapters that I know of, like a much longer book, that I just want to go back and reread that section on its own, to re-experience and consider its many ideas again. And I love having completed a big long novel like this, that I can now do this, that the rereading can just be of these absolutely beautiful sections that I really got the most out of. The central idea of the book that I found most engaging was the discussions of time in this, and that happens both in the dialogue but also in the structure of this book, because the sanatorium is high up on these mountains. The residents experience time in a very different way from the rest of society, because they are caught in these kind of loops of behavior. So one day comes to feel very much like the next, and it discusses the relative nature of time in the story of how when you have routines and every day is sort of the same, then time passes very quickly. So for a lot of the residents, they lose kind of perspective on just how many weeks or months or even years have passed by, but also in this high altitude, really the weather works in different ways, and the seasons aren't experienced in the same way as down in the flatlands, as it's contrasted with. So with summer and winter, that there may be very rapid shifts in the weather and different extreme temperatures, which don't necessarily adhere to the actual season that they're in. The narrative itself shows the way that time works in this subjective way, because for the first year that Hans is at this sanatorium, there is a lot of description about changes that he experiences and encounters that he has, but then years will pass by at a much more rapid pace, and as the novel goes forward, it really skips forward much more quickly, and this kind of simulates his experience of time and getting caught up in all of these different routines. And there's also a chapter in this novel where this authorial presence comes in. I mean, the authorial presence is felt all the way throughout the book, but in this one chapter in particular, there is this discussion about time in novels and how that can be represented, which is such a fascinating discussion, and is another chapter that I just want to go back to and read on its own. And finally, I found the ending of this novel incredibly poignant, and I don't want to give any spoilers, even though it's a classic. It's been read for many years. I don't want to give anything away. In case you haven't read it, but I found it really beautiful. Especially the way that even though Hans feels extracted from larger society and sort of outside the bounds of normal time, he finds that he is still entrenched within it because these are the years leading up to the First World War, and how it shows that progression, I think, is so powerful. And I finished this book with a slight feeling of melancholy for this boy who, over the course of the novel in these several years, he hasn't really experienced the fullness of life because he's been living far removed from it, but at the same time he's been able to enjoy this kind of rarefied experience where he doesn't need to worry about integrating into everyday society because all of his needs are cared for, and so he can really focus and study, and but at the same time this concentrated existence is so removed from actual reality. It's kind of wondering, like, well, is that actually living, and what actually makes a fulfilling life? And so I'm left with these kind of haunting questions about existence and study, and it's something I naturally wonder, caught here in my library where I spend hours and hours reading and kind of removed from the rest of the world and not actually living in a way. But then at the same time, just reading, and I feel like I come so alive and so connected to larger society in this way. And so I enjoy how this novel kind of subtly explores all of these conflicts about the nature of being over an extended story. And even though there were sections of this book that I really struggled with, that I really had to push myself to keep reading and get through, I'm ultimately very glad that I continued on reading it because there were some absolutely delightful surprises that came on, especially later in this novel. So I advise you, if you are reading it and really struggling to continue on with it through these lengthy speeches, you might want to just kind of skim read them a bit more and then get to the meatier storylines, because there is some absolutely fantastic sections and surprises in this book, because even though it's written in this quite traditional kind of realist style, or at least on the surface, there are some parts of it that are really strangely surreal, and that were absolutely a delight to discover. So it's a book that I'm going to continue to contemplate, but also I'm left feeling with this sense that, oh, okay, I've got over this literary hurdle now, and even though I'll continue to think about this book and want to discuss it, I got to the end of this great big novel. So I would love to hear any of your thoughts about this book. If you have read it, and now having listened to me talk about it, are you interested in reading it now? Is it one that you think you want to take on the challenge of reading it, or are you happy to set it aside and say oh, that's probably one that I'll never get to? Please let me know about that in the comments below. But also, I read Death in Venice a really long time ago, but that's the only other Thomas Mann I've read. So would you recommend reading any more Thomas Mann after this? But I'm really enjoying the Empusium so far, and how Tokarczuk takes on a much more feminist take on this story, and I'm looking forward to discussing it with my online book club. But I hope you're doing well and reading good things, and I'll speak to you again soon. Bye-bye.